Like my friend Anita Krishna in Canada, she worked for a global news or a big news network. She started to ask just regular questions. She's like, isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? We're a news organization. Isn't that what we do as a news organization? And she got fired for that, of course.
Crazy.
Yes, I did. Everybody, welcome back to the channel. I don't play that intro all the time, only on special occasions when I feel it's been a while since I mentioned that I did work for Global News for 24 years and was fired. I was a newscast director and I was fired when I started to question the COVID narrative. Anyway, thank you for hopping on with me today and joining me on today's episode. Standing by, I've got a journalist whose articles I read and I respect a lot. He works for the Epoch Times. His name is Matthew Horwood. He's standing by. But first of all, there's two things I'm going to talk to him about. He's written two articles, one of which is this one here. You might have heard the latest news, Tamara Lich, okay? Freedom Convoy organizers Tamara Lich and Chris Barber have been found guilty of mischief for their roles in the 2022 protest in Ottawa. Matthew was in the courtroom. He's going to tell us all about it. Let me just run a little clip first to set the scene. This is the clip as the news says it, which I don't like their writing in it. But anyway, let me play this for you, and then we'll bring in Matthew.
The organizers of a so-called Freedom Convoy that paralyzed the capital for weeks in February of 2022 have both been found guilty of mischief. Tamara Lich, Chris Barber were convicted for their roles in that mass protest, which destabilized Ottawa. The protest drew thousands of people, lasted for 3 weeks. It was originally about public health measures during the pandemic, but it did turn into, as well, an anti-Trudeau government demonstration. The trial wrapped up in September after hearing 45 days of evidence and legal arguments.
There you go. That's how they tell it to us. They say the so-called Freedom Convoy. Matthew, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So do you, first of all, before we get into it, do you find that annoying, the way that the mainstream media says so-called? That is completely editorializing, and it's just not a phrase they should be saying, but they say it all the time. What do you think of it?
I found it interesting how they've framed it in that way for such a long time, and maybe personally don't quite agree with it.
Yeah. What possible jail term or sentencing could they have for something like this?
Yeah, so there hasn't been any sentencing happening quite yet. That's going to come in a couple of days. But, you know, being found guilty of mischief, and Chris Barber also being found of counseling others to disobey a police order, that could come with house arrest. I mean, if we look at Pat King, another Freedom Convoy organizer, he was charged with several more counts, and he was given house arrest for a period of a couple months. And given that Chris Barber and Tamara Lich have already served in jail time, that could mean that they could be given more lenient sentencing by the judge. Was
there a lot of public support out there? Was there a crowd gathered, or were people in Ottawa just sick of them, or was there support?
Yeah, there was a ton of support yesterday. I mean, pretty much every day that Chris Barber and Tamara Lich have been in court, there's been a group of supporters outside and coming into the viewing gallery to support them. There have also been some people not so happy with their presence that have been counter-protesting, but they have been fewer in number. But certainly yesterday, the majority of people in the very crowded courtroom were in support of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber.
Like, they've already done jail time. This poor woman has already been in jail. I know Chris Barber has been in jail. I mean, time served. Did you think that that will be a consideration, that the judge will consider that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely going to be a consideration, and as well as the time that has been taken to go through this trial is going to be a factor in this. And the judge also said that because Tamara Lich and Chris Barber tried to work with police, they tried to, toward the end of the protest, get the trucks out of the downtown core to alleviate the suffering that people were going through with the honking and the diesel fumes and the block traffic. She said specifically that she's going to take that into consideration, and that will likely lead to them serving a more lenient sentence and maybe avoiding any more jail time.
So you thought the judge was more reasonable than you expected?
Yeah, I mean, just from my time spent covering this trial and seeing the way she interacted with the Crown prosecutors and the defense, I didn't take her as somebody who was extremely biased, as somebody who had an axe to grind or was trying to railroad the two of them. I mean, she seemed to not take at face value a lot of the Crown prosecutor's arguments. One example would be when the Crown would say that by saying hold the line, Chris Barber and Tamara Lich were only saying that the protesters should remain in Ottawa and continue protesting, and of police directives. She made the point throughout this trial that phrasing can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It can mean to hold true to your values. It can mean to continue to fight. It can be seen as even a song from the 80s. I mean, she didn't accept, again, at face value, some of the arguments, and the fact that she did not charge them with mischief or with counseling others to disobey the police. She made very fair arguments in that case, and she, I know a lot of people that support Chris and Tamara might not be of the same opinion, but having sat there, having heard her arguments, having seen her thought process, she seemed to be trying very hard to be very fair and just and see both sides of the arguments. She said that the court is going to return on April 16th to estimate the time for sentencing at a later date. So, this trial was only supposed to last about 16 days. It took over a year, and it's going to be going on even longer than that. So it seems like the trial that never ends, and it is the longest mischief trial in Canadian history, many have said.
Oh my God.
So that is I think, how she was being fair, and she was seeing both sides of it, and she was not letting the Crown run away with the narrative and only believing what the prosecutors were saying in this case.
Okay. At least that's encouraging. Hopefully she'll be light with the sentence and not be ridiculous. Like in this country, there's a lot of criminals real criminals that get out. I know because I talked to the RCMP. So I hope her sentencing reflects her good judgment, and I hope that she has good judgment. That's all right?
Yeah, we hope that for all judges. Sure.
We do hope that. Okay, and then another thing that you've been writing about, you've been very busy, is the tariffs. Okay, the Trump tariffs. And sometimes because these tariffs are almost like crying wolf to me, they come, they go. He proposes them, he lifts them, he stalls them, he extends them. They don't seem to always, people are on tenterhooks a little bit, right? And I think therefore the stock market has been suffering and all that because of it. But I was going to do a video on the tariffs last night, and my brain started to hurt. Like I couldn't even wrap my head around it at all. But let's play a clip of Carney, and then we'll get into just talking a little bit about the tariffs.
As I told President Trump during our call last week, Canada will respond to the U.S. auto tariffs. And today I'm announcing that the Government of Canada will be responding by matching the U.S. approach, with 25% tariffs on all vehicles imported from the United States that are not compliant with CUSMA, our North American Free Trade Agreement, and on the non-Canadian content of CUSMA-compliant vehicles from the United States as well.
Huh? What? I can't. Nothing he says makes any sense to me. Okay. So first of all right. Donald Trump hit Canada with 25% auto tariffs at midnight. Carney announced 25% counter tariffs. Am I right in that, or am I? That's correct, right?
Yeah, so you're not alone in being confused by it. It's been a very confusing couple months, and I think that is part of the goal of Trump, is to make it so chaotic and confusing that companies just move their businesses back to the U.S. But the latest in this is, yes, the 25% auto tariffs that Trump announced, and Canada responded in kind with those 25% tariffs. But I mean, going back a couple months, you had first the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico that Trump then paused for a month after Canada and Mexico gave concessions on the border and fentanyl and illegal immigration, which is a big concern and the reason he gives for putting these tariffs on. And then in early March, he put the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% tariffs on Canadian energy. But right after that, he gave an exemption for both U.S. car manufacturers and goods covered under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that he brought into force during his first term as president. So that exemption applies to 50% of U.S. imports from Mexico and 38% of Canadian goods, those have no tariffs at all. And then we had the 25% on steel and aluminum tariffs that he announced a couple weeks after that. And then we get to the current tariffs that he's put on the automotive industry. But he's also talked about putting tariffs on key industries in the US, such as lumber, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. So there still remains to be seen how much more economic turmoil Canada and the world, by extension, is going to be thrown into. Yeah, I'm not totally certain on this. Don't quote me on it. My colleague No Way, I believe, covered that more closely, but it was a auto plant that was going to make, I believe it was electric vehicle batteries that is no longer feasible, and the investments that the Canadian government made into that plant might not be recouped. So that is hundreds of millions of dollars that Canadians potentially might not see return to them, but remains to be seen.
That makes sense because he's America first, and Canada should have always been Canada first. But I feel like it took until Trump waving his finger at us for us to sort of pretend to care about ourselves. I mean, I find some of the things we're doing ridiculous, moving the liquor off the liquor shelf when the taxpayers already paid for it here in BC, and the things that we're doing. And everybody all of a sudden is buy Canadian, buy Canadian. Well, why weren't you like that in the first place? You know, why does it take Trump wagging his finger to want you to care about your own economy? What do you think about that? Do you think that this is like the Canadians are almost like, oh yeah, we're going to buy Canadian now? Well, what were you doing before?
Yeah, certainly there are symbolic gestures, and they're not going to make a big hit to the U.S. economy in a lot of cases, since we're 1/10 the size, 1/12 the size maybe. But yeah, I mean, people get afraid, they get angry, and they want to do anything they can to help out with Canada and alleviate their anxiety. And that's the easy way to do it, is to have elbows up and purchase Canadian liquor and buy Canadian. I mean, it's a way of them to self-soothe, I guess. But people do that in all sorts of circumstances, and we saw it during COVID. It's, I think, a lot of the same anxiety in the way Canadians are dealing with that. You can see parallels to the COVID pandemic as well.
And you're right about the CUSMA. Like, I looked up, with Canada, US, Mexico, with all these countries combined, apparently it creates up to $30 trillion in nominal GDP. So that it's a big deal to be part of CUSMA. You don't want to get dumped out of this. So you're right. And then if Trump kind of dangles these things in front of us, it is very scary. I have one more clip to play. Doug Ford has been very vocal. Like, he's always on the American show. Sometimes he puts his foot in it by saying, we're going to cut your energy, which is not something you should be saying to people. And so he got scolded for that. But let's have a look at this. This is about the tariffs.
Well, and considering Canada was not on that list, we understand the existing regime is in place. So the tariffs that are in place, with the exemption of goods that are USMCA compliant, does that mean, sir, at least in your mind, that it wouldn't be appropriate for Canada to retaliate for this at this time?
That is correct. If that's the case, then I would highly recommend to the Prime Minister not to retaliate. And let's carry on a strong relationship. Let's build the AMCAN fortress, American-Canadian fortress, around both countries, and be the wealthiest, most prosperous, safest two countries in the world.
Now you say that. Let's be wealthy. Let's be prosperous. Let's get along. Let's get along. If somebody has a problem with you, go down and talk to them, especially if they're a bigger bully. You're not a bigger bully, but you want to negotiate. That's what diplomacy is about. I feel like that's what we should be doing as a country.
Yeah, he is hard to predict, and I think that he potentially doesn't know what he's going to do sometimes until the day of. I mean, we saw that with the 25% tariffs initially being pushed back by a month. I don't think anybody expected that. But he could pull out of CUSMA, but I think it would be more in his interest to renegotiate it and to make it better. I mean, after these global tariffs that the U.S. announced, they made the point that if Canada and Mexico were to do enough on the border in terms of illegal drugs and immigration, then they would go on to a new regime of 12% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico into the U.S., but all CUSMA goods would be at no tariffs once again. So that would be, at this point, the best case scenario for Canada and Mexico. They didn't say anything about getting rid of the CUSMA deal altogether. And again, Trump is the one who negotiated and signed off on this deal during his first term and said that this was one of the greatest deals of all time. In terms of if Trump is waiting until after the election to negotiate, that is what he said during his phone call with Carney. He said it was a fantastic phone call. It was very productive, and that they were going to make a good deal for Canada and Mexico, and that the two men were going to speak after the election, set to happen later this month. So it remains to be seen who is going to win the election. I think Trump was looking at the polls, and he sees that Carney is, whether you believe the polls or not, he is far ahead of Pierre Poilievre right now, and he is planning to negotiate with him at the end of this month and work something out on economics and defense. Well, I think it's certainly a difficult position to be in for any Canadian administration, conservative or liberal, because we're so dependent on the U.S. for trade, and they have such a larger population, economy, and let's be honest, military size that puts us in a little bit of a bind. And the two, conservative and the liberals, seem to be in agreement on a lot of things. They both said that they want to have reciprocal counter tariffs on the U.S. They both talked about using the funds from those counter tariffs to support Canadians in a manner perhaps similar to how they were supported during the COVID pandemic. And it's a kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario, because if you capitulate and acquiesce to the U.S., then you're just going to get steamrolled, and you're going to have to give a lot of concessions, both in terms of economics and potentially even, military, or as the U.S. has talked about, water sovereignty, and even the Canada-U.S. border, some potentially redrawing those things. But if you go too hard on it, and if you get really militaristic, and you go potentially the route of what Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened, which is to shut off or put a surcharge on energy exports into the U.S., then you're opening up a potentially huge can of worms. I mean, you see that, for example, Russia used its energy as a weapon against Europe, and it was threatening to cut off energy exports into Germany and some of these other countries that are dependent on Russian oil. So if Canada were to do the same thing, then that opens up, potentially a very catastrophic series of events.
Like I've said this before, without even spending a penny, by Trump waving his finger at us and scolding us like a dad would, we are now looking at ourselves. Hey, but, what about us? What about us? And we should have been looking at ourselves, our own industry, our own interprovincial trade. We should be making Canada flourish, not trying to suppress us. And I think that's on the minds of a lot of people. And we look to our government leaders to be role models and to drive that ahead, and they don't, sometimes, which can be frustrating. You're right. But Matthew, where can people check you out? You're on X, aren't you? Or where can people follow you?
Yeah, they can follow me on X. Just search my name up and I'll come up. Or you can read my article on the Epoch Times Canada, right? About 2 to 3 articles every day. So very busy with analysis and covering the big breaking news of the day. And that's where you can find me.
I subscribe to you guys, and I pay for the year and all that. And it's a wonderful resource to have, because it like pings on my phone and I'm like, oh, and then I get the headlines right away. And many times it's you, it's Noé Chartier. It's a lot of, there's writers now that I recognize, and then I'm like, okay, this is good. This is good. I'm glad we have it. So anyway, thank you for joining me on my podcast today. It was great to talk to you, and I hope I talk to you again in the future.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great conversation, and certainly I'd like to talk with you again sometime.